Yep. Want to respect everybody's time here today. Thank you for joining us on our fourth quarter policy outlook. My name is Jake Ward, and on behalf of the TSMA Steering Committee, thank you for joining us here today virtually. First, we want to thank our sponsors, which is Berry Plastics and German American. We would like to, again, thank their sponsorship. Also, the purpose statement of our of TSMA is to work collaboratively to create a vibrant and attractive manufacturing environment in Southwest Indiana that results in improved revenue and profitability and an increase in manufacturing sector jobs. We're excited today here. Also, the steering committee thank each and every one of you for continuing to carry the torch here. So thanks a lot. Wanted to remind everybody the peer groups, if you have not registered, November 19th for the CFO and December 16th for the ERM peer group. And if you have any other questions about that, just go to the on the Chamber's website under TSMA. You can find out more information and also register there. We're excited to have Scott Paul here today to speak to us. He is the president of the Alliance for American Manufacturing. It was established in 2007 by some of America's leading manufacturers and the United Steelworkers Union. Scott and the American Manufacturing Association have worked to make American manufacturing and made in America top of mind concerns for voters and our national leaders through effective advocacy, policy development, and data-driven research. Scott is a sought-after expert on trade and manufacturing matters, testifying before numerous congressional committees and penning op-eds for the New York Times and other leading publications. He authored a chapter in the 2013 book, Remaking America, and has written extensively about Alexander Hamilton's role in forming U.S. national economic policy. Scott also hosts a Manufacturing Report podcast. Scott currently serves on the board of visitors of the political science department at the Pennsylvania State University, on the advisory board of the Manufacturing Policy Initiative of Indiana University, and as the board chair of the National Skills Coalition. Scott earned a BA in Foreign Service and International Politics from Penn State and a master's with honors in Security Studies from Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service. Raised in the small town of Rensselaer, Indiana, hopefully I said it right, Scott. He is a Hoosier. He currently resides in Washington, D.C. area with his family. So Scott, without further ado.
Jake, thank you. And extra credit if anybody can spell Rensselaer correctly the first time. It's a bit of a mouthful, but it's always an honor to talk to a group of makers. It's a particular honor to speak with a group of makers, many of whom are from or work in the state of Indiana, which is near and dear to my heart. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about what the policy environment is likely to look like for manufacturing in 2021, with the caveat that there's obviously a lot that we don't know. And so we'll try to give some guidance about what we can expect as well. If someone was giving this speech a year ago about what things would look like in 2020, they obviously would have been spectacularly wrong. So obviously take everything I'm saying with a bit of a grain of salt, but also with the understanding that in the policy space, we've seen ebbs and flows, and we know some of what to expect, if not everything at all. And if you'll shift to the next slide, Sean, I appreciate it. Jake went over some of my perspective on this. I'm a policy person. I am not a manufacturer. I will be the first to admit that. I love to tinker. I love to go to factories. I have been to literally hundreds of factories around the country, from Maine to California, from Florida to the state of Washington, from Minnesota down to Texas, and everywhere in between, because I like to get to know how folks are designing, manufacturing, what their supply chains, what their workforce, what their challenges look like. And so I bring lots of that experience into this conversation as well. I've had the opportunity to speak since the pandemic began with many manufacturers on our podcast about the pivots that they've made since February or March to the new reality that we all face. And I imagine many of you have faced a similar situation where you lost a market, where you potentially lost a workforce for a while, where you face some difficult circumstances, where you might have found some new markets, and where you might have found an urgent need for a pivot to develop products that are used in the response to the pandemic. And so I'll look forward, hopefully, during the course of this conversation, to hearing a bit about that. And please don't hesitate to use the chat function if you have anything to share. And I'll just, if anybody wants to indicate and feels comfortable doing that, just if your own businesses have pivoted to make products that are particular to this pandemic, like PPEs or other sorts of products, I'd love to know. I know I've had conversations with Jake about some of the pivots that Anchor has made, but I'd be really interested in hearing your stories as well. I'll just share one brief one from California that I came across. There was a relatively young man and his business partners that were making nets for lacrosse sticks, basically. And that was their primary business in Los Angeles. They were a bunch of college lacrosse players. And they also had designed some clothes, but they found an urgent need for cloth masks. And they pivoted quickly to that. And within a couple of days, they had 800 requests from different hospitals for orders and a staggering amount of volume that they could have done. And they were eventually able to scale up. They couldn't meet all of that, but some of these stories are pretty extraordinary and have been inspiring as well. And the other thing that I would just mention about my background, I wanted to mention this because of the Indiana perspective, is that Indiana University launched just a couple of years ago a manufacturing policy initiative within its School of Public and Environmental Affairs, SPIA, which is highly regarded. And the reason why I mentioned this is that there are not a lot of academic treatments of manufacturing policy throughout the country. In fact, there's only a couple that I know of that are a little more technical in nature. And so it was really great to see Indiana University take a lead in forming this manufacturing policy initiative, which is cross-disciplinary and brings together folks from their technical schools, from their business schools, from their public policy schools to look at manufacturing policy and to talk to local manufacturers about what their needs are. And it's just, as I mentioned, it's just been launched for the last couple of years, but I'm excited about its prospects. And again, if you'd like more information about that, yeah, you can just leave a note for me and I'd be happy to follow up with you because I think it is pretty interesting. Next slide, please. So before I get into what I think 2021 could look like and what are some of the trends as we head into that, I love to show this map, which is basically a manufacturing heat map of the United States. And the darker blue colors show a greater concentration of people who work in the manufacturing sector. And as you see, manufacturing is still a dominant source of employment and output in a number of economies throughout, I think, what I would call our nation's backbone, from the upper Midwest, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, down through Indiana, Ohio, Kentucky, all the way down to Alabama. And a lot of that is centered around the automotive supply chain, which accounts for about 1 out of every 9 manufacturing jobs. But the reason why I show this is also because as you move closer to both coasts, where I think a lot of the media, a lot of the influencers are in New York, Washington, D.C., Los Angeles, you see less manufacturing concentration. And so the conversation tends to become a little less informed. And this is something that I'm often concerned about, is that I think it makes sense for all of our national leaders, for folks who watch this from a media perspective to get to these states and to understand what's at stake, and to understand, for instance, how a state like Indiana still has a sizable portion of its economy and a sizable portion of its workforce in Indiana on a level that in manufacturing on a level that rivals a nation like Germany, and what lessons you can draw from that and why that's important. And I think that all of you obviously live and breathe manufacturing. That's why you're on this call today. But unfortunately, very few Americans still have a direct connection to the industry. You know, about 50, 60 years ago, virtually everybody or everybody's relative worked in manufacturing. And today that's no longer the case. Manufacturing is less than 10% of employment nationwide. In fact, it's closer to about 7% of employment. It's a smaller part of our gross domestic product, but it's a very influential sector for a number of reasons. I'm going to state an obvious reason because everybody's probably been looking at electoral maps recently. And what I'm going to say is that that manufacturing is concentrated in a lot of these key swing states, like Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, for example. And so manufacturing policy does tend to receive a bit of an outsized role in these contests, even if the media has a hard time understanding it or being able to cover it in an accurate and meaningful way. And the other thing that I wanted to mention about manufacturing, and again, I think you all operate manufacturing operations, and so this will seem intuitive to you, but even if manufacturing is only about 12% of our gross domestic product, maybe 13%, is about 7 or 8% of our overall employment, it still plays an outsized role in the American economy. It's a reliable job generator for workers who don't necessarily have or want a four-year college degree. And it's one of the few paths to the middle class that exists for non-college educated workers today. Second, it's still a major driver of research and innovation in this country. It accounts for about 90% of all the patents that are filed in the United States. And manufacturers account for about 2/3 of private sector research and development. So it again punches above its weight in terms of the value that it adds to the American economy. And just generally, it provides better wages than jobs in the rest of the private sector. And so it elevates incomes and creates more consumers and more folks in the middle class. And so our job at the Alliance for American Manufacturing is to try to make sure our policymakers know that, understand it, and get why it's important, and also adopt policies to make sure that it's strong. Next policy, next slide, please. Thank you. So now we'll get to the nitty gritty and what I think 2021 may look like, and a lot of this is obviously driven by the pandemic and the economic shock that we've seen, particularly since March of this year. And we obviously saw a enormous collapse in economic growth and output and employment in the second quarter. We saw somewhat of a rebound in the third quarter. Now that we're getting into the fourth quarter, that's slowing a little bit. And based on all the pandemic data that we see everywhere, it's likely to continue to slow as we enter the winter. It looks like we're in for a bit of a slog here as states start to tighten up restrictions in response to the public health needs, but also as consumers view this. And what we've discovered throughout this pandemic is that consumer and business behavior, particularly about large expenses, has been directly related to how people are feeling about the future and how they're feeling in particular about the public health situation, whether they think it's getting safer or not getting safer. And that's kind of how consumers are adopting their spending. And right now, there's still obviously a lot of concern. And so as a result of that, we've seen a couple of trends develop that are likely to continue into 2021. Our export performance, and I imagine there's a lot of manufacturers on this call who do export. Some of your exports may be increasing, some maybe hold steady, so others you may have found difficulties. And if you found difficulties, you're not alone, because our export performance in the United States has really lagged behind Asian economies, and not only China, but also Korea, Japan, Taiwan, Vietnam. These are all countries that had relatively fewer difficulties with the pandemic initially, and were able to recover much faster than the United States. Their economies kicked back into gear, and their market share in global volume and output and exports is actually increasing at the expense of the United States right now. And I actually don't see that trend stopping, at least for the first half of next year. I think that's likely to continue. Second is the attitude of American consumers and American businesses that are purchasing manufacturing goods as well. And we've seen dramatic shifts in consumer behavior since the beginning of the pandemic. Consumers are focusing a lot on value. They're focusing a lot on staples that they need. And they're focusing a lot on purchasing all of this online or through digital channels as well. And so manufacturers who are consumer facing, who lack these types of channels, have obviously suffered. And those that depend on retail outlets exclusively, kind of like physical retail outlets, have suffered as well. And again, I think that while consumers are slowly opening their wallets and getting outside nationwide, it's still been pretty slow, and it's likely to continue that way at least through the first quarter of next year as well. And another consumer trend that we've seen, if you just go back to this slide, just for, thank you very much, just for a second, is that consumers have really disrupted kind of brand loyalty as well. And that even if a consumer had 20 or 30 years of brand loyalty, it doesn't mean much in today's marketplace. And you've seen a lot of consumers buck that and also, find completely new channels for their purchasing behavior. And clearly, this is altering for manufacturers that feed into the consumer market for the holiday season in particular. This is going to have a dramatic impact on holiday shopping as well, and we're likely to see a big downturn in that. So not great news, but I think it's important to understand how to manage that as we move forward. I'll take the next slide now. Thank you. So when you look at the data that economists and analysts and financial houses look at to see where manufacturing is headed, there is an incredibly mixed picture. And there's not a lot of clarity. The Institute for Supply Management, which runs a manufacturing index, obviously for March, April, May, they saw that plunge really dramatically into a severe recession. Over the last 5 months, that index has rebounded a little bit. And again, if that index gets over 50, it means that things are a little bit better and are a little more positive and sustainable than they have been. And it's been growing consistently, and it's over 50 now, meaning that according to this index, manufacturers are a little more optimistic about the future, about either inventories or their workforce or purchases or their ability to export. But I will also say that its consistent growth has started to level off a little bit. And I think the folks who watch the ISM expect it to remain in positive territory, but barely. So not incredible growth. Now, there's another index called the Purchasing Managers Index, and that index is leveled off. And as they're projecting it forward, that index is expected to decline a little bit headed into 2021. And so the folks that put this together and who look at this are expecting a little bit of a downturn in manufacturing as we head well into 2021, at least for the first 2 or 3 quarters there. And a lot of this, may be tied to how rapidly a vaccine is able to be disseminated in the United States, and how quickly we can return to some semblance of normalcy here. And a third measure that is particular for the Midwest is the Chicago Fed, the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago's Business Activity Index. And that's been incredibly volatile since the pandemic began. And it dropped steeply, it went up, and it's plunged down a little bit. It's still in positive territory, but it's barely positive. And again, this is a survey, and I believe Dorothy mentioned your survey of business conditions. I think this is it on a broader scale, and what their respondents are telling them is that they do expect things to improve, but only a little bit as we're moving ahead across the board, from workforce to output to new orders and what have you. Next slide, please. So now we get to the policy, because obviously there will be a new presidential administration, and that's certainly what I think the business community is planning for right now. The control of the Congress will remain with Democrats, although barely. Control of the Senate is still uncertain. It's likely to be Republican. We'll know more about that after the first week of January. We can't say with any certainty, but the probability is that it'll be Republican, meaning that we'll have some divided government. But what does a Biden administration mean for manufacturing, and how would it be able to enact its agenda with a divided Congress? Some of it may come through legislation, but most of it is likely to come through regulatory channels and what federal agencies can do on their own. And so I do expect that we'll see a number of regulatory changes that will impact environmental issues, and particularly carbon intensive businesses. I think that some of these changes may be very aggressive. Some of them may have a positive impact on manufacturing, particularly those that are in the clean energy space, or those that are looking at electrifying vehicle fleets. That there may be very positive news for firms that are engaged in that. For firms, again, that are carbon intensive, there may be some increased costs that are associated. And so the real regulatory question there is going to be, is there going to be a way to offset those costs, either through some congressional, some tax breaks, or through some grant making or other sorts of schemes that would help to offset some of the costs of a more aggressive environmental agenda, and an agenda to deal with the climate change. Also, in the environmental space, I think the president will have to make decisions with respect to some oil and natural gas pipelines, and also with respect to natural gas exploration, which could have an impact on energy pricing as well as we move ahead. Obviously, energy prices are really low right now, in part because demand has really slacked over the year, and it's likely to continue to be that way for a while. But we'll see whether any of these regulatory changes will dramatically increase, or just somewhat increase the price of energy moving forward in a way that would be manageable. And so with respect to tax policy, which I imagine is a concern for most of the membership as well, Biden does have a pretty aggressive tax agenda. I think it's highly unlikely that a lot of that gets done because, again, it would require congressional approval. And from an individual perspective, Biden's plan, he says he wouldn't touch individuals who earn less than $400,000 a year. Will keep him to his word on that. For the business community, if you're a corporate ratepayer, he wants to raise the corporate rate from 21 back up to 28%. Although in manufacturing, I believe that he also has some manufacturing or production tax credits that he would be willing to provide. But again, I don't see a lot happening in the tax space because it would require the assent of a really divided Congress at this point, which in my estimation is not likely to happen here. Next slide, please. So there, with respect to Biden's economic policies and larger economic policies, I think that there are some things that could be helpful to manufacturing if, in fact, they are implemented. His Build Back Better plan includes major new investments on infrastructure. I know that manufacturing firms sometimes supply into the infrastructure market or the construction market through raw materials or other sorts of products. And by infrastructure, I want to emphasize that I'm not just talking about roads and bridges here, but also broadband, the electrical grid, school construction, our water infrastructure, and other things like that. And so you're likely to see a pretty major new federal investment in infrastructure. Biden is committed, in part because of our suggestion on this, that there would be a Buy America requirement associated with it, meaning that all the materials, all the content for this would need to be made in the United States, which has been part of federal policy for a long time, although the enforcement has been, pretty scattershot. And so if that is in fact enforced, it does mean that there could be some new doors open for American firms, both for incumbent firms who supply into this market or from new firms who wish to enter it as well. And you're likely to also see some procurement directly for pandemic response related items, such as PPEs as well, that would be made in America. And the last aspect of the plan that could be somewhat helpful to manufacturing is seeing new investments in research and development, as well as in energy efficiency, and for firms that are engaged in the clean energy manufacturing space. And by that, I mean, if you're in the wind power space or the solar space or other sorts of renewables as well, there might be additional cost offsets available there as we move ahead. Some of this will require congressional approval. There tends to be infrastructure is one of those issues that tends to unite Democrats and Republicans, and the question just becomes how much do you spend and how do you pay for this, which may get sticky. Then again, it may not, because interest rates are quite low, and there's been some willingness for congressional outlays during the course of 2021. That may open up again in I'm sorry, there was some willingness in 2020 that may open up again in 2021. We shall see as we move ahead, but that's something to keep an eye out for as well. Next slide, please. So with respect to trade policy, and again, I imagine most or all of you are in a manufacturing space where you either face import competition or you're in an integrated supply chain that is global, or you try to export into other markets. And so trade policy obviously has a pretty big impact on many operations. And I would say that the major difference you're likely to see between a Trump and a Biden administration on trade policy has much more to do with tone, style, and process than with actual policy differences. Now, and I will say that going into the Trump administration, I had thought that an overhaul of trade policy in the United States was long overdue. And that while there were certainly advantages to some free trade agreements and to globalization, the rules tended to benefit multinational companies that sought to bring imports into the U.S. market and disadvantaged our own firms. And the rules weren't well enforced either. And so I thought that President Trump brought an important spotlight onto some of those issues, particularly with China. and intellectual property and currency and subsidies and some of the state involvement with the economy that we saw, and thought that that was long overdue. Again, the President Trump tended to kind of tweet out his trade policy. That's not something that you're likely to see in a Biden administration. It's much more likely to be deliberate, well telegraphed, and appear to be more strategic. There will be some decisions that the Biden administration will need to make. The first one I list here is with respect to tariffs. There are currently tariffs on some imported steel, some imported aluminum, and some products from China. And some of these tariffs are up to 25%. And I think as I look ahead, that I think these tariffs are likely to be in effect for some time. I don't see them being peeled away by the Biden administration anytime soon. I think that they would only be withdrawn or peeled away if there is some alternative put into place. And by alternative, I mean either an agreement with our allies to deal with China a little more forcefully on trade matters, or some domestic market development and some rules for competition that are fairer in nature to domestic firms. But I don't anticipate that on day one of a Biden administration, or even on day 100, that you're going to see a dramatic rollback of the tariffs that were put into place over the course of the Trump administration. I do think that another action area for the Biden administration is to look at the deal that President Trump made with China in January of last year, to see what needs to be kept, what needs to be altered, what else needs to be negotiated, and how we can approach that perhaps in a multilateral setting together with some of our allies in China, bringing a little more of market forces to bear on China than we were able to do under the Trump administration. I honestly don't know how successful that strategy would be. I think that there are some companies that feel the weight of competition from China as much as the United States, and who will want to participate in such a venture. I do think that there are other countries that are a little more reluctant to challenge China, and who won't want to be a part of that. But ultimately, I think that dealing with economic issues with respect to China, their currency policy, the massive subsidization of industry, some of the state-owned enterprises that are operated by the Chinese government, the amount of overcapacity in key industrial sectors that they inject into the global economy that distort prices. I think that's something that Biden is going to want to find some way to address more aggressively than, say, the Bush or the Obama administrations did, but probably in a different way than the Trump administration did. And I will add on a layer that I think that Biden will be more concerned about China's carbon output than Trump was, and will want to seek more action from China to reduce carbon emissions, which obviously creates both a global problem and a competitive problem for American firms that don't face the same sort of or that have more constraints on them than firms in China with respect to that. And then finally, in the trade space, I think that looking at new trade agreements, because there have been a number that have been mentioned over the past few years, something like the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement that looked at the Pacific Rim, or a U.S.-UK free trade agreement, or something more broad with the EU or with other countries. I think those types of issues, again, are likely to take a back seat for the time being to domestic issues on the Biden administration's radar. And so there may be some new trade agreements that could create opportunities for American firms if they're done the right way. But I think those are going to be farther down the road as we move ahead. Next slide, please. So, and I just wanted to, I think, end, my outlook with a couple of trends that were brought to bear during the pandemic that are likely to continue or be accelerated even as we see the impact of the pandemic abate over the second and third quarters of 2021 if all goes well with respect to the dissemination of a vaccine and we don't run into problems there. And some of those trends are going to be quite obvious to all of you because I think many of you face these issues. Supply chain resilience, that is understanding who your suppliers are, what their risk factors are, and how you can build in either some redundancies, backup plans to create a sort of resiliency that in some cases was lacking before the pandemic. I think is going to be incredibly important because this may be once in a generation public health crisis, but we have seen many events over the last couple of decades that have disrupted supply chains, ranging from political risk to natural disasters to man-made disasters to tariffs altering equations that are, I think, going to cause firms to look a lot more closely at how they align their supply chains, particularly if they're global. And as I mentioned, I think risk mitigation is going to be a key aspect. It's not just going to be the price you pay per unit of widget. It's going to be your total cost of ownership and a lot of other factors that firms are going to be looking at. And I think in some cases, and some surveys show this as well, that many manufacturing firms are looking at localization strategies when possible. And I want to emphasize when possible, because in some cases it's simply not possible, either based on a cost structure or availability of materials or know-how or a workforce. But I do think that there are a number of firms that are looking at bringing their supply chains closer to home as a way to mitigate risks and to ensure that there's more resiliency as we move ahead into the new normal. Obviously, that could create opportunities for some of you who are parts of supply chains, and I think that the cost factors, how those are calculated, are going to change somewhat from and look a lot different in 2021 than they did, for instance, in say 2017 or 2016. I think a second trend is that you're likely to see firms both discover and want to seek the ability to have flexible manufacturing capabilities. And by that, I mean, if you're a larger firm that has a number of factories, you're going to want to look at the ability to produce your product lines in more of those factories that you have, instead of just having a specific specialization. And that's important in terms of adjusting to demand, but also some of the other risk factors that I've been mentioning on here. And at the same time, I think firms have discovered that with a little bit of know-how, elbow grease, and ingenuity, you can actually produce things that you never imagined you were capable of producing under the right circumstances, and they found new methods to do that, and potentially new markets to sell into as well as a result of that. And I think that's something that will stay with firms for a long time. On the workforce end, I do think that we've discovered that flexible work hours are more important than ever to a large number of workers, depending on family demands or the types of other demands that they may be facing. And that the typical first, second, and third shift, may still be optimal in some circumstances, but more employers will have to operate, I think, with more flexibility and understanding of that, and that workers will come to expect that and will be seeking jobs where that is available to them. And again, my call to manufacturers, because the manufacturing workforce, quite frankly, is older than the American workforce more broadly, and has a fourth of all manufacturing workers are over the age of 55 and they're going to be looking to cycle out at some point in time, is that, the old way of recruiting employees probably isn't going to work over the next 4 or 5 years, and that employers are going to have to show some more flexibility and some more insights into how they can recruit a new generation of manufacturing workers with the right set of skills. And things like flexible work hours or dependent care benefits may be a part of that. And then finally, a trend that we obviously saw underway before was automation. And I think many firms are, to the extent that they can, are speeding up their ability to automate, which obviously will displace some jobs, but will also create many new job opportunities for maintenance or for programming within the manufacturing workplace as well. And I'll just conclude with these thoughts because I'd love to hear any questions, comments, feedback that you may have. And thanks for sticking with me here. And that is just to say that the policy outlook is, I can give you my best guess on, but the most important things that tend to impact the fortune of manufacturers are, first of all, just how the macro economy is doing. And the president has the ability to do some things about that, but many things are out of their control. And we've seen that throughout the course of post-World War II history as well. There have been some presidents who have talked a lot about manufacturing and ended up seeing a lot of manufacturing job loss. And there's others where the opposite happened. And the words that I would leave you with are just that the macroeconomic performance, global trends tend to impact manufacturing employment and output more than any other factor, more than an administration or more than a political party. And that's something that's been true in the United States in every instance since World War II. So it is the partisan makeup of the Congress and the president can make some difference, but overall, their ability to really make things a lot better or a lot worse is limited unless, of course, there's something unanticipated and there's some move that's either so brilliant or so boneheaded that we haven't anticipated. And I certainly hope it's not the case for the latter. Perhaps we can hope for the former there. So again, thank you so much. Keep on making what you're making. I'll look forward hopefully to engaging you here for the time that we have left with some questions, comments. I'll be happy to answer anything that you can throw my way. And I want to thank Shonda for forwarding the slides. You did a great job. Thanks so much for your work there as well.
All right, anybody have any questions or any questions that came in on chat there, Shonda?
We haven't had any questions on chat yet, but if you would like to just do that and I can make sure that Jake sees them.
All right, so no questions. Not even one here. All right. Well, we do want to thank everybody for joining us today. We are looking forward to getting together here, something other than virtually here sometime in the near future. I did want to say real quick, if you are not already following us on Facebook or Twitter or LinkedIn, please do so. We are doing our best to share content there about our upcoming events and our peer groups, and I would encourage you to do that. Also, if you're not even sure about how you can benefit from TSMA, I would encourage you to reach out to somebody on the steering committee or reach out through one of these platforms to any one of us, and we would love to talk to you about ways we've used it, how it's benefited us as far as providing personal and professional growth for our organizations. So we'd love to talk to you more about that. And last but not least, we want to thank our gracious sponsors, Berry Plastics and German American. And again, we look forward to seeing you next time, hopefully, possibly in person soon. But and Scott, thanks again for joining us today. We greatly appreciate your time.
Jake, we do have one question from Timber.
Okay.
He would like to know, what initiatives are we seeking to help manufacturing workforce for the future?
Thanks, and Jake and Dorothy, thanks again for that, and Timber, thank you for the question. So this is obviously an area that's still under development, and there are several layers to this. There's obviously the individual effort that manufacturers are making, and I think we're seeing more of that, although you all have limited resources, limited ability, and can only have a certain amount of impact given your size and scope. I think manufacturers who tend to offer pre-apprenticeship or apprenticeship programs when they can, or partnerships with local community colleges or high school technical programs, do tend to have better results in terms of the recruitment pipeline. And so I always encourage folks to follow those as best practices. I think that there are some state systems that do reasonably well, and I think Ivy Tech is a good example of that, of a far better than average state level technical training provider that has shown it can do real partnerships with businesses to try to create that type of a talent pipeline. Unfortunately, the constraints that folks like Ivy Tech face are, and this is no knock on all the four-year, well, actually, this is a knock on all the four-year colleges I went to, is that so much of our education money in this country goes to the minority of folks who are going to get a four-year college degree, where most Americans need something between a high school and a college degree as they're entering the workplace. And so I think that that's something that Biden's going to have to grapple with, quite honestly. And simply canceling student debt isn't going to help. You got to, I mean, it may help folks who have some student debt, but you need some proactive policies as well. Now, one of the things that may help is that his spouse, Dr. Jill Biden, has been at a community college for some time, and I think understands some of these needs. And it's good to have someone in the White House who does understand that. I'd like to see this become an area of larger emphasis, because I do think there are both Democrats and Republicans in the House and in the Senate. And I can think of many from Indiana, Kentucky who are involved with this, who want to make a difference, but who face some fiscal constraints as well. So I don't think it's any longer a case that kids find workplaces to be dirty, dark, dangerous, because I think that, there's enough information out there about what things look like today. But I do think it's reconstructing those pipelines for talent that are eroded, and apprenticeships, just investing in them is going to be key to get that started. And I hope that that's one area where we could see bipartisan agreement in 2021 as well. It's a great question. I'm glad Timber thought to ask it.
We also have a question from Corinne Hurt. In their office, they've seen that, and she works for a employment service. In their office, they've seen quite a rise in wages in order to attract and then retain talent through the pandemic. Do you think you'll see this trend continue, or will the wages likely drop once vaccine and the pandemic diminish?
It's a great question. The other variable is obviously, what is demand going to look like for manufacturers, and will they need to hire on, or pay overtime or do that? And so that's what we don't know yet. But I do think that you'll continue to see some need to accelerate wages to be competitive into the future, and that there had been a manufacturing wage premium in part because it required a bit of sharper skills than, say, those in the retail sector or other sectors. That wage premium eroded a little bit as some firms look to temp placements or other sorts of mechanisms to fill in gaps. But I think once again, you'll continue to see a bit of wage pressure. I don't know that it'll be extraordinarily inflationary, But I think that's one of the keys that manufacturers will have to understand, is that combination of wages and benefits, because manufacturers tend to offer better benefits than their peers in the rest of the private sector as well. But having an attractive package, I think, is going to be important as we move ahead. And I don't think that wage pressure is going to go down unless we see other economic circumstances, like a continued decline in output and demand, as you would see in like non-pandemic times as well. Another very good question. Yeah.
Well, I'm going to say that was the last question that we had, Scott. So,
Well, thank you all. Thank you so much.
thank you.
Thanks again.